I just spent the last few days in Detroit visiting schools in that city. And over the course of last Thursday and Friday, I managed to visit 6 schools, 2 K-8s, and 4 high schools that reminded me of schools in New York City, probably in the 1970s. These were buildings where parents turned their children over to the school system, where those who turn up, and they only turn up occasionally, as well, at least in the high schools. I think 2/3 were there the days I was there. Children who do show up hope for an opportunity to learn and improve their lives. Teachers who are trying to make sense out of teaching students with remarkable life and academic challenges. A central office that is clueless over how to deal with nothing but low-performing schools. I'm talking about schools where you can't find a single good teacher. And the experience helped to crystallize for me the trajectory of the New York City schools over the course of my career. Because when I began teaching in the early 1970s, only 1 out of 2 students graduated from high school in New York. And in the schools that I saw in Detroit, they would be lucky if half the kids were graduating. I've got a feeling 50% is an aspirational goal. I opened my own school in the 1980s, as I became a superintendent in the 1990s, and up to the early part of the 21st century, things remained pretty much the way they were. We had large school buildings that had been built in the middle of the 20th century. As you walked in, there were marble gleaming halls. The schools and libraries were veritable citadels of learning that had been built in another age, where amassing all of the young people in that community to these repositories of knowledge was the most effective and efficient way to educate young people. And despite the fact that we're in the 21st century and most of us have more access to more knowledge in our pockets than we did in those school libraries and in the libraries and schools, those schools remain as they did in the middle of the 20th century, as they look in Detroit. And in New York, starting at about 2002, 2003, under the administration that I was a part of, the Bloomberg-Klein administration, we began closing those schools on a wholesale basis. Places where 1,200 kids would be enrolled in freshman year, and 900 of them would be left back. Or places where only 20% of the children made it to junior year. In one school, 1,700 students were enrolled, 1,200 were freshmen. In other words, you could get into those schools, but you could never graduate. And we began closing them and opening them with new small schools. In tandem to creating newer, smaller, hopefully more innovative schools, we started our own leadership academy because the feeling was that we could no longer trust the universities in New York to produce both the number and quality of reform-minded principals that we needed to move education into the 21st century. And so the city started the New York City Leadership Academy. Many of the people who began as leaders of our new small schools were graduates of the Leadership Academy, not all, but many. And over the course of the next 6 or 7 years, we opened 500 new small schools, including 100 charters. And the graduation rate in buildings that graduated barely 30% of the students shot up to somewhere between 70 to 80%, simply creating a more human scale and giving others who had better ideas an opportunity to realize their ideas for the benefit of the children and themselves. What's clear about public education is that if we continue doing business the way we've always done, and we structure the organization, or allow the structures in the organization to remain as they were when only half the kids graduated, then you can't perpetuate an organization that historically has graduated half of its students and expect that you're going to see significantly better results. If you want to see different results, you've got to do something differently from the way things were done in the past. I met two colleagues who I did not know from the Department of Education, who prior to the presentation this evening talked about how the current administration is attempting to recapture the imagined perfection of the past. And what's sad about that really is that organization that they're trying to recreate was perfectly designed to graduate half of our students. Over the 10 years that I was part of the Bloomberg-Klein administration, we created a new kind of organization, networks instead of districts and some other changes, that was perfectly designed to graduate 2/3 of our students. But at the end of the day and at the end of the year, the 2/3 that got to graduate were largely female, largely white, largely Asian. The kids who did not graduate, largely African American, largely Latino, largely male. So the hard work is clearly ahead. And the reason I focus on structure and the way business has always been done is that I'm sitting with two friends and colleagues, Alisa Berger and Mary Moss, who understand in their bones that if you want schools to be significantly more effective in raising student achievement, then you've got to do school in a very different way. Alisa and Mary use technology as a springboard to turn their school into one of the few truly great examples of a 21st school that I've seen in this city and across the country. And it's an enormous honor to be introducing them this evening. So Alisa is first up to bat.
When we were asked to start the iSchool, I think we were taking with it a lot of the learnings being embedded in the autonomy zone with Eric and in the changes that were going on in the city, that's what we had to, that the message of we are an organization that's perfectly designed to produce the results we're getting is what we have to take to heart. And that high school, the way it was designed, was perfectly designed to get its failing results. And so we had to redefine high school. And the other big thing we took was that when the autonomy zone existed, Eric didn't mention this, he was pushing for that autonomy is not a reward for school success, it is a precursor to school success. And this is how we feel about the school, and it's why we wrote the book. That innovation is not a reward for turning a school around, it is the only means to transform the school system we have. Because all of our schools are perfectly organized to produce their results, and we have to rethink them. So when we think about Detroit, that it's not we fix the schools and then we think about innovation, is that innovating is the way that schools will be fixed. And when we started the iSchool, we have a very clear model of what's in place. And we'll talk about that. But our goal was not to say this is the model and every school should be an iSchool. But what we do think is that every school has to be asking the questions that we were asking about your curriculum, about how you're using human resources, about school culture, and innovate around that. So we organized the school around 3 core beliefs, and those were the things that allowed for us to innovate. The first was that we were going to meet the need of any individual student that walked into the school and move them forward. So for us, clearly understanding where kids are in terms of their academic achievement, and then saying, wherever you are in that continuum, that's our starting point, not some pre-described starting point by what it means to be a 9th grader or a 10th grader, whatever. The second belief was that school had to be relevant to students, and at this age, kids have to have real choice and control over their learning. So we say all the time in classrooms across the country, we're going to learn this, and this is going to be really important in 10 years when you get out. And high school kids we're working on pushing their time frame to like a week, maybe a month. 10 years, like I still am working on that time frame, and I'm luckily out of my adolescence. So saying that school has to be relevant to them, that they have to feel like the work they're doing now is important work. And they're not preparing for their future. They're preparing for their future while they live their lives in the moment, and that is important. And part of relevance is to give them control and choice over what they're studying. And the third was that school institutions, as much as being incredibly focused on academic achievement, has to also be in focus on the social and emotional growth of our children. And that the same respect and focus we give to providing an individualized program for who they are as academic individuals, we have to give the same time and focus to who they are just as people, and focus around that.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how those core values played out in terms of the instructional model at the iSchool. And sort of first and foremost for us, and what I think we both believed was the most sort of critical part of our school model and what we hoped kids would get the most from and create the kind of experiences we knew they would be talking about and remembering 20 years down the line. And so that was our challenge-based learning. And we created sort of a model similar to project-based learning, but really taking it one step farther so that the work that students were doing was for a purpose, a client, a reason that went beyond the walls of the classroom. It was no longer a project that was turned in to the teacher for a grade. This was something that had purpose. And we saw so many examples of kids really rise to the occasion because this was a new level of almost more public accountability. It meant far more to them than, the high stakes testing. This was getting up in front of a board of directors at a museum and pitching them your idea. And these were the kind of skills that we knew would actually ensure that our kids were successful in college and career. But we were still obligated to all of the requirements, both in terms of testing in the regents, but also in terms of a college prep foundation. So we also used online learning, and this was where we were really able to harness the power of technology, not to replace the teacher or the learning experience, but to really enhance it and to personalize it so that we could have a student take a test at the beginning of their Global History Regents Prep online course. And if they had mastered a certain amount of content, they could move forward at a much faster pace that they were ready for. For other students, it enabled them to watch videos multiple times if they needed that support in order to do well. So online learning played a key role in helping us to ensure that kids were able to move through requirements at a pace that worked for them. It also enabled us to expand our offerings as a small school, and we used online and distance learning to bring in more options for our students. But sort of the most important foundation for both of those parts of our model was a strong advisory program. Seeing the development of students from 9th grade through 12th grade when they're supposed to be ready to go off and live and work and learn independently, is not something that happens without very explicit and direct support and encouragement and the explicit teaching of the skills that we knew they would need to go out and be independent, both as learners and as individuals. So we felt that a model with those three components would really provide kind of the well-rounded kind of environment that our students needed. So we're going to kind of move into the next part of our talk, which is really to talk about, so what does this mean moving forward? And Alisa and I both have moved on from New York. I'm now in Charlotte, North Carolina. Alisa's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we've kind of taken different paths with our work as well. And so Alisa's been doing more work around turnaround innovation, and so she's going to talk about that in just a minute. And I'm actually starting another school and have worked with a lot of principals who are kind of trying to bring more innovative practices to their school. So one of the things that I've certainly found as I'm going through this process again in a new place and in a very different context is that iSchool was I guess, what we wanted people to get from the iSchool model and from our book was that it's not about everyone trying to do the iSchool model, that was the solution that would fit every context, but rather it was sort of the thought process and structure that we went through that we hope people can learn the most from. And I think that that's certainly been the case for me as I sort of replicate this process again in North Carolina. And in this instance, I'm doing a kindergarten through 8th grade school. So it's like applying these lessons in a very different context. But it's still been helpful to continue to use the same process, even though the model is going to look somewhat differently. In terms of what it looks like for me at K-8 level, is I still think it's a lot of kind of back to those same core values, meeting the needs of each student. So we're doing a lot of personalized learning. And one of the things that I'm really focusing my planning year on is mastery-based learning and really putting that in place early. I think it's something that Alisa and I talk about as being the one big sort of unfinished part of the iSchool vision that we didn't do as well. And I think we probably made a mistake in that we didn't start it from the beginning. Because as you know, it's much harder to get a group of 30 staff members to change their practices than it would be to start it from the beginning. So that's really one of my highest priorities with the new school. And part of that will actually be building into our curriculum where students understand their role in that and understand what they're good at, what they need to work on, and what they're going to do to get better. The other part for me is, kind of the authentic learning, the 21st century skills. Again, that has to look different in Charlotte, North Carolina than it does in New York. For me, it's very new for the city of Charlotte to have a school located in Uptown. When I look at the Charlotte skyline, I count like 12 buildings. So it's a very different model. And so we will be the first public school in Uptown Charlotte that actually uses the resources in the city sort of as our expanded classroom, which isn't new to anyone in this room, I'm sure, but it's new for Charlotte. Yeah. And so we will be doing the same kind of challenge-based work, just kind of at a different level, obviously, for elementary school. And finally, part of the 21st century skills that I feel are really important, again, in Charlotte, is global awareness, which we are going to achieve through that sort of constant interaction with our city and resources, as well as through a dual language program. So for me, it's been about kind of taking the same core values and figuring out how does it need to play out in this different context. There have been definitely several sort of lessons and questions that I still have. The first is that this is my first charter experience. So our schools in New York were always part of the Department of Education, and I just wasn't able to do that in Charlotte, so I had to go charter. And it's been interesting to be in an environment where there were not many constraints. And in some ways, when there are no constraints, it's very easy to just do what you know or what has been done. So I did talk about it a little bit in the book about how constraints can actually spark innovation. And I think we have to, as educators, realize that constraints should be an opportunity to figure out a way around or within. And that sometimes when you have no constraints, which I think we often wish for, it can almost put you more in a sort of self-imposed box that we realize. The second challenge that I'm having is really about balancing innovation with what's developmentally appropriate for kids. So I'm really struggling with, like, how do I provide this personalization without having a kindergartner see 8 different people over the course of the day? So that's a big challenge. Another one is around hiring, finding the right balance between people that have enough expertise and experience who've done this work before, but with the ability to rethink what they're doing. Because I need people, and I think it certainly was always an issue at middle and high school levels where you really needed teachers who got adolescents. And if they didn't, it was always a struggle. And I need teachers that get little kids and what they need, and how boys just aren't going to sit down, and if you get mad every time they're out of their seats, that's not a good thing for anyone. But how do you find that with, also that mind that, okay, but they need this, but this is like how we can rethink everything else. I think the other big thing that I'm dealing with in Charlotte is how much newness can the community handle and take. As a charter, our life depends on the number of kids who are enrolled. And if I present something that's totally new, totally different, am I going to get students? And how much are parents ready to walk into a building and not see classrooms and not see desks? So I'm really trying to find the right balance there. And then finally, doing all of these things differently and trying to start it all at once. And how much is too much all at once, but what are the things that you can wait on? Because if you wait, sometimes it's harder to go back and do it differently. So that's kind of where I am with the work of the iSchool and what we talk about in the book in a new school context.
So I'm not sure it came through clearly to the people who are just meeting Mary and Alisa today for the first time, but they haven't started one new school. They've started 2 new schools, and now we hear from Mary. She's about to start her 3rd. And as someone who once upon a time started my own school, I can tell you one school is an enormous undertaking. 3 schools is a remarkable feat. And I'm glad that you have the blueprint in your own book. What's really interesting about this book is that unlike what many do, including myself and others, in retelling our own experiences, what Alisa and Mary have done is, after telling their own experience, they put together a how-to guide for creating an outstanding and innovative school. I'm going to ask a few questions just to get the juices flowing, and then we'll happily open it up to your questions and comments. And my first question really is around what is it that we're preparing students for? And I say that with the understanding that guys like Apple CEO Tim Cook continuously point out that neither Bill Gates nor Steve Jobs went to college. Google from what I've read, is now intentionally looking for students who've selected experience over academics for their entry-level positions. And Tony Wagner in your book seems to make a very similar point in your introduction. So what would you say to students and parents concerned about whether or not their youngsters should go to college and incur what these days could be a debt of $150,000 or more?
So I think we are huge supporters of the CTE movement because we do believe that experience is as valuable, if not more valuable, than our traditional educational model. And I think a little bit what we were trying to do at the iSchool was give a little taste of the CTE model within a college prep sort of packaging.
So career technical education for those.
Thanks. VOTEC, for what we used to call it. And I think, we certainly struggled this with our own students who, while might have gotten into very prestigious universities, at the large majority, like 95+% ended up at state schools because it's all that they can afford. And we started doing the math with kids. You're going to spend this much on your education. How much do you have to make your first year out of college to start paying it back? I remember doing this with Margarita, $140,000. What's the likelihood that your first year out of college, you're going to have a job that makes $140,000? So let's be clear, we're telling you 0. That's the chance that that's what you'll make first year out. And so this you cannot make those choices. So I think we want to, and we believe in functioning within the system. I would love for us to get back to a point in society where you do not need a college education to be successful in the workforce. But I think a college degree has become now what used to be a high school degree, which is sort of what you have to do to get the lowest level job. And I'm not a fan of that, but I think that's the truth.
Okay. Thank you. When you remember back to iSchool classrooms, can you describe kind of typical activity that kids might be engaged in? And what does that say about your belief set about how kids learn best?
So I think that for the most part, especially in our more ideal classrooms, we had some where it didn't happen. It's not a perfect place. That it was very much based on the workshop model that we see at sort of all grade levels, or the I do, we do, you do kind of model, but that there was always sort of a framing and a discussion that involved the whole class, but then the majority of class time was spent with students applying the new concept, idea, thought to something. And certainly that looked different if it was a challenge-based learning module class, or if that was a more traditional science college prep class, or maybe it was a literature class. But I think that for us, the biggest or the most important piece was that students were doing the talking, not the teacher.
I would also say that we sort of rejected the notion of the lesson, that the hour or the 2 hour, the 90-minute or whatever block happened to be in play at the moment, that was not the period of time we were working in, that we were always looking at a 9-week frame, and that kids' work was over a 9-week frame. And so if a teacher could say, we were definitely going to be doing this next Tuesday, I'd be like, well, we're doing something wrong. Because when we're matching students to where they are, I can't predict. I mean, I can have a pretty good guess, but I cannot 100% what I'm going to predict what all of the kids can do at that time.
So teaching is listening and learning is talking. Yeah, that's. Where did you find teachers capable of implementing the kind of model that you implemented?
Well, I will say that there were, we did not solve the problem. You know, we did not solve the challenge of always finding the right person for the job. I think we found early on that we had great success with new teachers because we could tell them how to think and how to act and how to be in the classroom, and with really experienced teachers who were up for a challenge. Like, they knew what they wanted to do, they had their feet under them, they were like, I want to try something new, I'm okay with not being the expert in the room, I'm totally comfortable. Mid-career teachers, which, you know, in education is like 5 years in, 4 or 5 years, were not successful because they had sort of just gotten their feet under them. And for us to say, so everything that you've done to achieve success up to this moment, I want you to throw out and start over was too much. And I think what we struggle with and still struggle with is everyone wants to be innovative, right? I mean, there are very few teachers who would walk in to interview for a job at the iSchool. I mean, they looked at our website, they knew what they were doing, that didn't want to teach this way, and so would say, you know, yeah, I want to do that, but that doesn't mean when push comes to shove in the classroom, this is what you really want to do. And so how do you get underneath that in a hiring process is really hard.
One false assumption that we had at the beginning is that we were very interested in kind of taking down the traditional silos of high school departments. And so we thought, we want teachers that say, I teach kids, not I teach chemistry. And so we hired a bunch of those people. But what we figured out was that deep content knowledge actually enabled them to do these really amazing real-world projects because they understood the content at a level enough that they could see the connections and they could actually communicate really well with the experts that played a role in our lessons. And it was people that didn't know the content in some cases that really struggled. So I think that that's still a balance, but
Knew the content but didn't also hold it up
Right.
As
the end-all be-all. Right.
Former regional superintendent of the other side of Manhattan said that when she interviewed teachers, she looked for 3 things. She wanted to know the last book the teacher read, because if the individual wasn't a reader, she wasn't going to hire her for her K-8 positions. She wanted to know whether this was someone who liked children, and she wanted to know if this was someone who was interesting enough to want to have dinner with, because if she wasn't, she'd have a hard time getting the kids engaged day after day. For most of my time in public education, there were severe shortages, particularly in key areas. Very hard to get a math teacher, very hard to get a science teacher, hard to get a bilingual or an ESL teacher. Sometimes it was hard to find special ed teachers. Today, it seems there are dozens, if not hundreds, of applicants for each position. In the current context, is it easier to change a teacher or to change the teacher?
I think, first of all, I think the reality has not permeated through the system. But if there are, people still think of teachers as a hard to find. You know, every position is a hard to staff position. I think, you know, interestingly to all of that is that we never had a hard time finding physics or chemistry teachers. It was always hard finding social studies teachers, which, like, everyone always says there were millions of. But
There are 2 right in the second row.
okay, so you're the hardest to find. And I think that when you're doing something different, there are a lot of habits of mind that go along with really wanting to rethink your practice. First of all, there's a huge growth mindset. Like, if you don't have a growth mindset in this innovation work, you can't do it. If you're not comfortable with failing and like having disastrous lessons and rising up the next, I want to say day, but next 10 minutes to like redo it again, you can't do this work. And all of these sort of habits of mind and heart that we're now saying all these kids need are actually the same habits of mind and heart that all the adults in schools need. And that I believe it's really hard to change those, not in little kids, but in adults. And so I can't hire for people who don't have them.
So now on a slightly different track, and I apologize for this question, but I have to ask. The iSchool had fairly selective admissions criteria, and yet the presumption of the book seemingly is that the model could apply and be effective for a broader range of children. On what basis do you draw that conclusion?
I'll start. So first of all, we had very selective admissions criteria because we got more money for having very selective admissions criteria, and we did not employ our admissions criteria to the extent that we were expected to, and we got in trouble every year for doing it. But while, about, depending on the year, we had 30 to 40% kids below grade level coming in, that's certainly not representative of the typical New York City public high school, even though it's not representative of a highly selective high school either. And actually in year 2, I think, we dramatically increased our special education population because we wanted to take on this question head first. Like, if we're going to prove that innovation works, we have to prove with the hardest to serve kids. And so we asked the DOE, and shockingly, they were willing to give us a significant population of kids who had real learning, who were defined as having real learning disabilities. I would say they had really bad education for 9 years, most of them. And it was really interesting to know, what do you do with a 9th grader who walks in who cannot yet read? And how do you make that child successful? And, it was shocking to us that we could use his IEP to allow us to have someone read his regents to him and transcribe his regents for him, and he could pass his global history regents by just watching videos about global history. And that the part of the failure of our special ed system is that I would say of our school system is, and especially our school system when we talk about our hardest to serve children, is that we spend so much time on basic skills and then use anything on the sort of top half of Bloom's taxonomy as a reward for doing this. And the reality is that you can't get stuck there, right? That's boring. So we only teach basic skills as a means for teaching the higher order skills, and that understanding is not a result of the low level work. It is how you do the low level work. And so by engaging kids in this work, by sort of flipping Bloom's taxonomy on its head, we get kids who are engaged and are able to make real progress, both on the objectives that I care about and the ones the school system tells me I'm supposed to care about.
Yeah, in the words of Bart Simpson, you mean you're going to teach me slower in the hopes that I someday catch up?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
What are the conditions under which a school like iZone can take root and excel? I mean, can it happen in any environment? Are there prerequisites for the kind of structure and system you're in and the attitudes?
So I think I can speak to this a little bit because in the new school that I'm creating, that I tried for 6 months to a year to actually do within the district in which the school was housed, and it sort of came down to 3 big things. The first, and this is probably one I could continue to have worked around, but the first was that there was no autonomy of budget. And while some of that you could work around, they give you a budget to the level of like, this is how many teachers you can hire, and this is how many teacher assistants you can hire. And that was frustrating because I would have traded in some of the front office personnel for more teaching assistants or another teacher, and they're just, that kind of trade wasn't okay. The second big one was that they change leaders a lot. So one day you could be a principal at this school, and the next they could tell you, well, we need a principal and we think you're a good fit and we're gonna move you over there. Or we're gonna, we need this assistant principal, we think they're a good fit for this school, we're gonna make them principal and we're just gonna assign you an assistant principal. So that, to me, if you can't even guarantee that you're gonna have the ability to see your vision through, or that you have a team that can help you do that, so I think autonomy in budget, autonomy in leadership, the ability to be secure, not, obviously if you're not held accountable and you don't do the job, I understand that, but the sort of not even knowing whether you'll be there would be another.
I think we've both experienced the grass, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence sort of thing, having left New York, I feel like this is the work we did in New York could happen in New York and could almost happen nowhere else, because there was just, we had complete autonomy, curricularly, instructionally. There were so many instances where we would get calls from people that would say, you're not allowed to do that. And I'd be like, well, call the chancellor's office. I am allowed to do that. Like, I looked at the rules said, they don't say you're not allowed to do that. They say this other thing, and I'm not violating that rule. And I think the work that was done, that you did at the autonomy zone, that all of that enabled us to change how we think about schools. And I feel like everywhere else in the country, they're talking about district schools versus charter schools, and that is a total false dichotomy. It is about where you have the authority to control what happens in the building. And that people go charter, Mary's going charter, because it doesn't exist in the district, but if it exists in the district, there's nothing inherent in a district that doesn't allow you to do this work. It's all about the leadership in the district.
Thinking back to your years at the iSchool, can you think of a single piece of student work that you think most represents what the school was about?
The chessboard. So, I jumped. The first thought in my head was a chessboard that a senior created as part of a senior project. But my second thought is, should it be a different speech that a kid gave it? But this student was studying Shakespeare, and she was looking at Shakespearean tragedies as games of chess. And she created a chessboard. She 3D printed the pieces of the chess pieces with the faces of different teachers in the building to be different roles, and played out decisions that the school made as chess games and aligned them to works of Shakespeare. Wow. I was like, yes, this is what a senior project should be. And it was so cool.
What was the challenge that was just fun?
The senior project was, you have to create new knowledge. So, and they're high school kids, so their new knowledge sometimes can be working in a professional lab and creating new knowledge with other people, or if you're in the humanities, it's really about creating new knowledge. And her area of focus was English, and she wanted to study Shakespeare, and I said it's hard to create new knowledge around Shakespeare. Well.
So just to contextualize Alisa's response, I visit many classrooms in the course of my work, and the only question that I get more absurd answers on than when I ask teachers, what are you working on with that kid, is when I ask principals, what are you working on with that teacher? They psychoanalyze teachers. They tell you all about their life story, but they never get at what the work is. And then when you say, so what's the best piece of student work you've seen in your school? They don't know what you're talking about. So it's really, how long's it been since you've been at,
It's my third year out.
yeah, I mean, just heartwarming for me anyway. Last question before we open it up for the brave souls who've come out this evening to be challenged. What type of college experience would you hope for the graduates of your school? Would you hope for your own biological children? And what message do you have for colleges around how to get to that kind of educational experience?
Okay. So we live in the backyard of Harvard. So every kid in Cambridge wants to go to Harvard. It's like in the water or something. And we tell our daughter all the time that that's not what she should be aspiring to. I can say that because my husband teaches there, so it's not like, it's okay. And we talked to her about, she's very interested in farm to table. She's interested in farming. She's interested in cooking. And we're like, you should go to college on a farm and work on a farm and learn to cook. You know, she wants to go to culinary school. I'm like, you should do that. You should do that. That should be your college. And she said, is there a college that does that? And I said, I don't know. Not sure. I haven't found a mainstream college that does that. Maybe there is an obscure one. But that's the college I want for her. It's a college that prepares her for the future that she wants. And the reality, I think one of the sad things we see is that the pedagogy at many community colleges is far better than the pedagogy at more elite institutions. And so if I want my kids to be taught rather than just learn from a book or learn from a lecture, I don't want them to aspire to the best institutions. And you know, I feel like that's a tricky dichotomy for me when I think about our students and where they're going to, and my own children.
For me, I would say, and I actually feel like I had this as an undergraduate. I went to Bates College in Maine, which I loved. And the first is exposure to what's possible. The second would be opportunities to explore and to direct your own learning. And I was able to design my own major, which was very important to my whole path. And the third is like a small, well, for me, a nurturing community that provides the support to enable you to get there.
Same thing as our
Same
school.
thing as I want in a K-12 school.
To turn that around a little bit, I as a parent, incurred a bill of about $140,000 at a time when that was serious money. When my daughter attended Hampshire College, which is a similar kind of learning experience. And she didn't graduate with grades because Hampshire never gave grades, but she did graduate with a 150-page transcript, which is essentially a remarkable description of who she was as a person and what her aptitudes and interests were. And she turned it into the New York Department of Education certification office one day to see how many credits she had satisfied toward teaching in the New York City public schools. And the answer that came back was 0. So
Yeah.
the disconnect goes in many directions. You've indulged me long enough, and we'll open it up for your questions. Start with Carol.
I'm sorry, I have to leave and teach in a minute, but I have to ask, so how's the high school doing without you?
I wish Zora's not in there. It's doing wonderfully.
She may be walking in. I know she's close.
It's doing wonderfully. I feel like I knew that I was ready to go when I was in a faculty PD and they were arguing about some schedule change. You know, staff was talking about some schedule change, and one of the teachers said, wait. The mission we have is to increase student choice. Which of these options maximize student choice? And I said, okay, like if our three-legged stool is embedded in the teaching staff, then we're ready to go. And I've said many times that I'm not going to talk for you. I'm really good at starting schools. It's a different skill to keep them going in the long term. And
I would say about 6 months ago, they made a new video because the one that they had been showing still had us in it. And I went and saw the video, and it like brought tears to my eyes because I recognized almost none of the faculty, none of the kids, that they were saying the same things that we said when we started it. And that was when I was like, this is like my proudest moment as an educator. And you would like never see me in any of it, but the fact that it is still going on is.
Now, your next proudest moment is when they take that to a new level.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes.
exactly. And actually, I've seen that. I actually visited today, and one of the math teachers showed me her whole mastery tracking system that like the entire math department has adopted, which was amazing. And then I went by and saw some of our science modules and how one of the teachers had put this whole, I think, like astrobiology, like gallery thing together. And I was like, you guys are just, and we have a green roof like plan, and they're fundraising for it. So they.
In other words,
Yeah.
visit the school,
Visit the school.
if you'd like to get inspired about what a school could be. Thank you, Carolyn. Great question. Others? Yes.
Can you talk a little about like discipline? I didn't hear any of this. I'm thinking about restorative justice. I'm wondering if your teaching population looks at all like the diversity population, but also when you're talking about students who don't have walls and things, it made me think a lot about the Boy Scout Scholar model, right? And they're similar in many ways, I think. So I'm really curious, like who is this for? Is this for all students? Is it a white teaching course? You know, it's just because it was.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, let's start taking them one at a time. It is, the school's for everyone. I would say our staff, I mean, I don't know who's there now, to be honest. When we were there, it was not diverse enough, but it was also not all white women. I think, I think the new principal is not white. I think that helps with recruiting a more diverse staff. In terms of discipline, I love talking about this. Not everyone loves hearing this. I believe that your discipline model needs to reflect your instructional model. Eric taught me many. I don't know. He said it to me many times. I learned it eventually about that. He kept trying to teach me, and finally I learned it. That the model of professional development that we provide teachers is how we want teachers to exist in the teachers to act with kids in the classroom. I believe the way we interact with teachers and treating them as adults and professionals is how we treat high school kids in a high school. So we did not have a discipline model per se, but it is a school that expects kids to act like people, and I think when you have that expectation, they do.
I know there are all sorts of outside issues and pressures that impact kids and that affect their behavior in school, but ultimately, behavior is an instructional issue. And if you can engage kids in a way that makes them feel as if they can succeed, then you're likely to have many fewer behavioral problems and disciplinary issues than in most schools, which are about the most boring place left on earth, other than locking a kid in a dark closet.
There's also this,
sad to say, really.
and there's this whole disconnect between our discipline and what we say we believe. Like, I'm going to lock my door when classes start, and you have to go to the office and get a note and then come back. And so I want you to be in class, but I just made sure you missed 15 minutes of class. So is class time important, or is it not? Like, we have all these rules, so we don't have any of those at the high school.
I saw that in a school in Detroit where there were 50 kids standing at the front entrance early one morning, and the classes had already begun, and I asked the principal what was going on. He said, well, they came after the classes started, so they have to stand there until the next classes begin. Could you just say a word about Kunskapsskolan for those who don't know about it?
Well, because at least the one that was open in New York, which is called Innovate,
Yeah.
was run on the Swedish model, right? It's called the Knowledge School, Kunskapsskolan. And it's all individualized learning, and it's an online learning portal, and they don't go to classes per se. It's all like you have your own kind of trajectory that you're supposed to follow. And having been inside of that building, I can tell you that you need to have, in my perspective, you need to have restorative justice. You need to have a discipline, something that you can like that is built in. I'm not saying that buy-in, like obviously,
Yeah.
good learning, cool instruction, no projects, kids will be down with that. That doesn't mean some kid's not going to slap another kid in the back of the head. And one thing that I saw when I was in some of the spaces was, the lack of structure, kids running around, and then suspension rates through the roof and stuff. So I was just curious to really hear about
So-
that. Like,
Is that school still open in New York?
I believe that it is.
Well, it's also developmentally appropriateness, right? Like what does an 11-year-old need versus what does a 14, 15-year-old need? Huge difference. And I mean, yeah, of course they do, and kids need rules, but rules need to exist the way I believe they should in society. I guess they don't always in society either. That allow learning to happen, not for the sake of a discipline program.
We had a colleague who was there during the initial implementation of that model in New York and left soon after because the stuff coming from above suggested that it was not going to be as well organized and effective as it needed to be.
And
That's
I'm,
because of the movement,
Yeah.
though. Like, that's
Right.
what I'm thinking
Yeah.
about. Like, that was one example that's local, but I'm just thinking about, like,
Sure.
your walls.
and I will add that I think when we talk about it with the personalization and all of that, that it seems and it gives the impression that it's this very loose, open thing, but it's actually very tightly structured. And like modules, while the teacher may not sort of know because we're not sure the progress kids are going to make, like what's happening next Tuesday, it doesn't mean that like it's not all carefully planned out and facilitated. So I think that there is a lot of clarification, and I tell teachers when we're doing the planning of modules during the summer, the more tightly you plan it now, the better it's going to go later. And it's a lot, like modules are like this insane pre-planning ordeal for teachers, but then like once you get into it, it's not as much on a day-to-day basis. So I don't want to undermine like how much careful planning and how much like very intentional and explicit like facilitation goes into it. And that, is something that we would encourage across the board. The other thing is like, I think because we were both experienced sort of before a lot of these like restorative justice or discipline with dignity or whatever these other programs have come out, I think like we are aligned to those programs, but we never said, okay, this is the discipline program we're doing. I think we were very much about that discipline should be about teaching kids the appropriate behavior and helping them to figure out how they're going to make better choices versus discipline as punishment. And that was kind of our guiding philosophy, which I know is in alignment with a lot of those programs. But because of our advisory and because of the size of our school, I mean, when kids brought alcohol into the school, I mean, it was like a nightmarish, multiple days of talking, and they talked with every adult. We brought their parents in. I mean, we made their lives miserable over
Without any punishment.
all of those things. So that so there wasn't a lack of discipline. It just was like, we're going to nag you until you figure out how to get back on track. And that was kind of, I think nagging is our discipline model. And there's
Love you
something
too
about
much.
like the love and care and the tough love behind that. And like, you might not like me at all right now, but you will eventually. And yeah.
For discipline is an excuse to have a guidance conference with the kid and their
Right.
family.
Or
Yeah.
start calling the kid on their cell phone at 6 a.m. if they need to get
Right.
up to get to school on time,
Yeah.
instead of just punishing them for coming to school late.
Right.
I mean, there's
It's more about the solution versus like the punishment.
Other questions?
I just have a question about that actually. My colleague here, Laura, and I, we work in a school where our discipline is the same. And we found that teachers love it, the parents love it, but the kids won't buy it. Have we had that experience?
Say more.
So the kids are, talking about them.
And what age are they?
They're high school.
High school.
Yeah, and I know exactly what you mean when you say the nagging. The kids see it as nagging. You get at them, their attitudes, not necessarily what they do, but there's the principles behind what they do. And they find it to be overwhelming sometimes. They get annoyed by it, but their parents love it because we really get at the issues, and the teachers love it. But the kids somehow they're not all into it yet.
Well, are they, I don't have any problem annoying them. The question is it working? Is it making their behavior any better? Is it helping? Are there incremental
Well,
improvements?
generally, I tell teachers that for me, it's an investment in our future. And a lot of the kids don't get it right away.
Yes.
But we have graduates, we have alumni who come back and tell us that our model worked for them. And when they're in college now, they see where it serves them.
Yeah.
But they're miserable while they're with us.
I tell them that's the point. That's my job. is
I
to
think
make
for
them
us, there was
miserable.
also this whole thing about picking battles. And I
Yeah.
remember when our first year, we had all these kids come in with like shaving their head and doing crazy things to their looks and thinking that they would get in trouble. And Mary giving them instructions on how to do their mohawks better. Like, really, you're using the wrong product. You need to. And they were just sort of like, wow, you're not going to engage with us on like our teenage rebellion at all. And we were like, go rebel. Like, you can do whatever you want to your hair. Like, that's good. I don't know. So I think they felt,
And I also
we
think,
wanted them
yeah.
a lot over as allies by doing stuff like that with them.
I think sometimes high school students don't have the skills yet to engage effectively in a lot of those reflective practices. And so sometimes the would-be discipline moment actually becomes a teach-in where you are giving them feelings vocabulary or you're giving them kind of strategies to either articulate a problem. Because if they are passive in the most aggressive model, they're not going to buy in.
When you start a new school, invariably, early on, perhaps the first conversation you have with teachers is, what's going to be our discipline policy, what's going to be our attendance policy? And my suggestion, again in line with my previous comment about discipline being an instructional issue, is start by creating the most effective instructional program you can, and that'll take care of a good many of the discipline issues. Not all of them.
And attendance
But if
issues.
school is interesting and engaging, if it's a place where people feel they're known well by their teachers, and if they think they have a chance to succeed, there is a lot less likelihood that they're going to act out in ways that the school is going to have to turn itself inside out to deal with. Not always, things will impinge, but begin talking about instruction. So, other questions? Yes? No, please.
Want to use technology in their subject. They have some problem with teaching or with some how you encourage how you motivate them to use technology.
Great question.
Well, we're talking about the firewall. So, and then you can say something else. So one interesting thing that we did at the iSchool that I still haven't fully analyzed, like the results of, was we created a firewall between curriculum planning and curriculum teaching. So there was no notion of I'm going to plan the courses I'm going to teach. It was I'm going to plan courses and then we'll see what we're going to teach. And sometimes you did end up teaching that thing, but sometimes you didn't. And we did that for a few reasons. One reason we did that was because what we saw over and over again in small schools was that there'd be this amazing teacher who did this amazing project, and everyone looks forward to getting to 11th grade English so they can do this amazing project, and then that teacher leaves and it's gone. And we didn't want that to happen. And when everyone, and even if the teacher leaves you the box, like no one can recreate it. And when you're writing curriculum for yourself, you write at a different level of clarity and specificity than if you're writing for someone else to teach it. And in doing that, we also started looking at what are teachers' real strengths and what do they enjoy doing. And some teachers love creating curriculum and are really good at it, and some hate it and aren't as good at it. So saying if you hate it and you're not good at it and you don't really want to work at getting better, let's not invest time in that. You can be everyone had to be good in the classroom, but you don't always have to be good at the curriculum planning piece. And it was in that planning that some of the technology happened. And so on some level, as long as we could get the technology into that piece of it, it got into the classroom, right? And if you were a teacher that wasn't into technology, but I will say because it was used so, I don't know what the word is, ubiquitously, it just made you would see everyone else's classes going well with it, that you would want it. And then that it happened sort of naturally. But then we should talk about Curtis.
Yeah, so the other big piece for us was how we envision the role of our technology director or coordinator. Was that, I think in many schools, the technology person finds some device, gives everybody the same training on it, and then we say, okay, go implement it. And people that maybe were already excited about it go and use it, and then the rest of the people don't need it. Well, our model for all professional development was what you need as you need it, when you need it. So the same was true for technology. And so our technology coordinator, Curtis, would sit with teachers, talk about the instructional goals and vision that they had, make suggestions for the technologies or the tools that would help the teacher kind of design how to use it, be there in the classroom and available the first time the teacher used it, or the second or third, depending on how often or how much. He actually enabled teachers to sign him out for different periods when they would need him. And that made a big difference. The other, I think one of the smartest things we ever did, and that person still remains probably the one irreplaceable at the iSchool, is that the first year at the school we hired a technician in addition to the technology coordinator. Because you want that person who is on call that can come and fix things. And then the two of them together have actually trained a whole group of kids that can also come and fix things. But I think those are, if you're going to do have a plan that has robust technology, that technician piece is really important as well. Because I think, yeah.
So developing the modules together was, I'm sure, a critical aspect of your professional development approach. Were you able to break down the isolation of what goes on in classrooms that teachers experience, or was it one teacher with a group of kids in a single classroom?
Well, modules are often co-taught because we were always giving multiple credits areas. So that did break down some isolation. And our schedule was driven by student interest. So we would give the kids the module choices, and then they'd sign up for them, and we'd say at the last minute, oh my God, we need to have 3 sections of this module, and we're not offering this module. So you, teacher, thought you were going to teach this, but instead you're teaching a section of this, which sort of required everyone to know all the curriculum because we had to be fluid and responsive to the student needs and interests and, adolescent whim. But I think the most interesting thing of the publicness wasn't in the classroom. It was that we have in the school our Creative Commons, which is sort of a student lounge area. It's actually the old gym of the building. We turned into a student lounge that also had the administrative offices are. And all meetings, like so when you're meeting one-on-one with a teacher or in the department meetings or anything, happen in the middle of the lounge. So all learning was totally public to kids. So kids saw us working as teams, trying to plan stuff, organizing stuff. They saw teachers working together on curriculum. They saw coaching happening. That this was all public. Everyone could see it all the time. And that's what allowed there to be so much transparency, less than in the classroom.
That's great. In the back there.
Your last question.
Yes, last question.
That's it.
Last question.
I'm just curious, like, if you kids or teens interested in all the technology, but what if you have an excited teacher like myself who's brand new, I say, yes, I'm so interested in this, how do you keep them interested in the curriculum that involves technology? What are they learning that's going to keep them excited?
The teachers?
Yeah.
So I don't know that I would think it was ever the technology that kept teachers excited. It was being able to teach things that you were passionate about. So the way our module planning works is that every spring, everyone would propose modules that they were interested in teaching. Modules are 9-week courses, so every teacher roughly teaches 4 a year. And kids would propose module ideas, and we would do a sort of a quick brainstorm, like, check of ideas, and then we'd give this survey to these kids of like 50 module ideas, and they'd rank them 1 to 5, and then like, just what do you think you might be interested in taking this course? And anything that did really badly, we just dumped, and then we took like the 25-ish most popular ones, and that number ranges, right? Because sometimes there were a lot of popular ones, and sometimes there were fewer, and we divvied them up amongst the staff to start planning, and I would say about half would fall apart during planning. Like we couldn't figure out how to actualize them in 9 weeks. They only took 2 weeks, they would take 6 years. Like it just wasn't clear. We needed to do some experiment that could blow up the building, so that's not allowed. And so whatever, they would fall apart during planning. And then we'd plan them and schedule and do them. And what kids will tell you, the smart seniors will always tell you, you never take a module the first time a teacher offers it because it's going to suck. You have to wait till the second time. And that's true, like that we get better as we're doing it. So I think that process of designing things that are interesting in you and teaching new things and that iterative process of teaching the same thing 4 times over the course of the year, sometimes, to be able to say like, some teachers have said that was a disaster, I'm not doing it again. But often they're like, okay, that was good. I totally know how to make it better. And I don't have to wait till next year. I'm going to start over again in 9 weeks and like totally make it better. And then teachers will do that for 2 years and then say, I totally want new modules. I'm dumping those on board. Or I'm going to dump one of my modules, but keep one of my modules. Or, whatever. They have freedom to play with that.
So I had a really long commute this evening. My office is on the 4th floor, and I commuted by elevator. However, Mary and Alisa came in from Cambridge and North Carolina, respectively, and please join me in thanking them for being here.